Thank you for coming. My name is Robert Reinhardt. Together with Jan Ozer, we've compiled the program for the Video Engineering Summit. I thought there should be a session on analytics, and of course that means I also volunteer myself to do that session. And it is time sensitive for me because as I've started to get more into live event production over the last 3 years, a good part of my business is now tech directing live events, so exactly what the gentleman in the back of this room is doing with Mobion. I have my own crew as well where I show up for live events and do very similar things, PowerPoint presentations with 1 to 4 speakers up on stage. And so a lot of that's going to be the basis for where I start this conversation with you today. That's just the session description. I'm going to skip right by it. So if you can, I'd like you to saturate the network right now by going to this video player. It's a JW player instance on a really basic web page. I called it multi.html because it's got multiple analytics happening on that player page. You don't have to go there right now, but if you leave it up or if you're on a laptop, let it run, hose the network, whatever. It's an adaptive bit rate, so you know it should go down to a lower bit rate. And it's just a VOD on a loop, something that's running out of a Wowza setup that I have going. Okay, so just real quick what I do, in addition to working with streaming media with Jan, I build solutions for my clients. I have several subcontractors on my team that do Android and iOS development. I do encoding reviews. I develop a lot of media server backend, mainly on Wowza, but I'm also doing Red 5 Pro projects now, and it's usually in cloud infrastructure. And like I mentioned, I tech direct live events. This is a slide that you've probably seen in some of my other sessions. This is typically the kind of infrastructures I have to build just so that you can understand when I start talking about analytics, you know, this is a live event stream, right? We're going to ingest some type of stream over some protocol into a streaming media server or CDN, and then we've got to get that back out to someone who's watching it in any number of flavors. And so where does analytics play on this diagram? Generally speaking, the simpler you can make your deployment, the easier it's going to be to add analytics to it. As you probably, again, I'm going to keep referring to past sessions I've done. This is typically all I need to do from that kind of architecture. Most of my clients are as simple as this when it comes to live event streams. It's an RTMP ingest going into some kind of GPU accelerated media server. I'm picking on Wowza here. And then we use CloudFront for distribution to HLS. We could be doing Dash too, but most of, just like you saw Twitch before me 2 sessions ago, HLS is I shouldn't say easily, but HLS has become, you know, if you're going to stick to one format, use HLS, figure out the way you're going to parse HLS on all your target platforms, and it's a done day. So where can we collect analytics in this? I didn't update this diagram in the show, but we can, you know, typically we're going to, oh, sorry, I do have one more slide that's easier to demonstrate this on. So, you know, I'm using hardware encoders. I'm a big fan of hardware encoders. Asia's got the Hilo. There's so many different hardware vendors out there. It's not funny, and they all do a reasonably good job of it. I've done hardware encoder reviews for the magazine. But anyway, going back to that infrastructure, you know, these are the popular players that I'm typically working with my clients. Most of my clients come to me with an existing player code base intact. Sometimes they want to switch over to a newer version. I take clients through version upgrades on JW Player all the time. But we've got BitMove, we've got VideoJS. Theo Player could be thrown in there just as easily. And there's I don't want to call him a new kid on the block, but Mux is there. Mux, I'll talk about it a little bit later. So analytics typically happens in the player end of it. I'm going to show you that you can also collect analytics on the Wowza end of things. But again, if you're using CloudFront as a distribution, analytics out of the server are meaningless, right? Because it's only seeing connections from CloudFront. So whenever you're using a CDN to distribute this content that's live, our origin server infrastructure is not really going to be a useful place for analytics. If you are building out an infrastructure like this, where you're building out your own physical edges with a layer like Wowza or another media server like Red 5 Pro, you could collect analytics on these edges because it's most likely the case, and I'd remove CloudFront out of this scenario, all the connections are coming into your own homegrown kind of infrastructure. But enough about all that. Let's talk about, so again, I said I do live event productions, and typically whenever I'm showing up for a live event or planning out that event with an organization, the first thing they're going to want to know is the number of viewers, right? So that's a pretty simple metric to gather, and that's usually going to be concurrent number of viewers. They will likely want to know the location of those viewers as well. Where were they? Since I do a lot of streaming for the British Columbia government, the provincial government, they'd like a lot of those ministry broadcasts are for internal government employees, and they'd even want it broken down within the province, like how many people from the north end of the province attend it, because largely webcasts are done so they don't have to pay the cost of travel, right? Use taxpayer money to travel. No, just get hire a crew like me. It's going to be a lot cheaper to live stream. So knowing the location of those viewers. And lastly, and again, there's other information, but these, again, the stakeholders that I typically work with, they want to know something about the quality of experience if I can give it to them. And that would largely be like, was there a lot of buffering going on, especially for a live stream? That's not so great because unless you have DVR added to that mix, you don't really get a do-over. People might just stop watching the stream and say, whatever, I'll wait for the VOD when it's available. And more importantly, I think for me, as I'm getting deeper into analytics, is understanding more of those switches in bitrate renditions, right? How many people were watching low resolution, how many were watching high resolution, middle resolutions, all those kind of tiers of analytics. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of that last category, quality of experience, to show you in any kind of meaningful way, although some of the vendors I'm going to talk about could show it for you. And of course, the other thing they want is that they don't want to pay for it, right? They're like, oh wait, we have to pay for these analytics. Forget about it. Just give us your best guess, or whatever. Give us what of those requirements. What can you tell us? Because they don't want to have to pay on top of anything else that I would be doing for them. So how does the typical analytics data flow work? Well, you got to collect data. In a lot of situations, those are called collectors in various analytics workflows and vendors. So you got to figure out what events you want to gather, buffering, paused. You might want to collect session ID, user ID, bytes streamed, agent used, just as a starting point. You got to store that data somehow after you've collected it from your player, putting it into some kind of log file, maybe a database entry. And then you got to be able to query that data and know how to query the data for useful fields that those data points earlier gathered, because as I will show you, it's easy to gather data, right? I should say it's easy, but that's the easiest part of this whole equation. It's doing something meaningful with it afterwards. And then after you figure out how you're going to query that data, that just returns back result sets. How are you going to visualize that so it becomes something meaningful to a stakeholder? Again, I should have made it clear in the beginning. I'm going to go through my slides. This deck will be available for you to download as a PDF, but I am going to sort of break out into demo mode shortly here. The demos are largely going to be with systems that I've worked with and are starting to investigate for various clients of mine. So when I first started out with live events, I would say 4 or 5 years ago when I was getting into the production end of it, I just did simple stuff with AW Stats and CloudFront. So CloudFront, if you're using CloudFront as an edge, you can have it dump its logs to an S3 bucket. You can set up an you can follow any number of tutorials on how to consume CloudFront logs with AW Stats and get some general information. And I'm going to break out real quick and just show you here that I had just had a couple web pages open. You can see where I'm going to go with this. So AW Stats, I have the links to where you can get this software. You can tell just by the web page and the fact that it's on SourceForge still. It's been around for a long time, and you can get, they have some sample sites running it, but you get really general information out of this, right? It was initially started to, it was originally built, I believe, for Apache logs for web servers, and it's of course morphed over the years. But you get an idea with just even some of the basic visualizations that AW Stats have of like who's coming, where are they coming from, how much data is being consumed, and they do now have filters that are specific to streaming logs. Again, most of my clients didn't necessarily want to, they would know just by looking at the CloudFront bill how much data was streamed on average. They could get a good sense of what was happening there just from how much bandwidth they were paying for. In addition to AW Stats, Snowplow. I don't know if you've heard of Snowplow. It's open, so AW Stats is open source. You don't have to pay for it if you got a dev on your team or you're really patient and can walk through tutorials. Getting AW Stats up and running isn't that big of a deal. I should mention as an aside, if you're interested in seeing an analytics workshop, like where we actually sort of learn how to do building these tools, let me know, let Eric know, fill out a comment card. We're always looking for new ideas for workshops as well as sessions here. So if that's something that interests you, please let me know, or the conference know. So AW Stats, I'm going to go into Snowplow. Hold on, I should have everything up. So Snowplow I found out because that government client I mentioned before. This is how basic we get with government, right? This is this is an event that's happening tomorrow. I got to fly out tonight to manage it super early in the morning, West Coast time. So this is just a JW player on a web page. And if we go in and look at the source on this, I'm just going to show you some Snowplow code real quick. It's not going to be the best zoomed view here, but I'm going to right here. So we've got. You notice they called a collector here. So this little JavaScript snippet here is all for Snowplow. I'm not going to go through all the stuff that it's doing, but it's really basic tracking for this page so that they know how many people are coming to this page. It doesn't necessarily track the clicks of this video. If they hired me to start getting involved with their Snowplow setup, I could probably figure out how we could start tying more events into it. Since they already pay for a license to JW Player, JW Player gives me an easy way to access events that are happening on that stream, and I could potentially tie them into Snowplow. If you're interested, again, all these links will be available up on the PDF, but Snowplow Analytics is available on GitHub. If you look at the tiny URL, it's just github.com/snowplow. And they've got a collection of repositories. They've got the server-side stuff. They've got a JavaScript tracker, Android tracker, you name it. They've got some stuff built around it. I shouldn't say you name it. I have no idea. There could be something easily that they're skipping. But anyway, it's there. And while I'm talking about GitHub, I should just mention that if you search for video analytic, I left the S off just in case there was some foreign repository. Like look at this. They didn't put an S on here, probably some foreigner that doesn't know English, right? So I would just search for analytic. That was a bad joke. But anyway, there's over 439 repositories just with video analytic. And you could look, I mean, I didn't go into each of these, but look at the first result. Bitmovin has an open source Android collector. It's probably specific to their backend and backend API calls, but if you wanted to see what Bitmovin was doing as a comparative analysis, you could look at their source code. So lots of repositories. And that's just GitHub, right? So there's no way if I leave out any kind of analytic system and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he didn't talk about X, Y, or Z. Do please let me know after the session. I'm always curious to know and augment to this presentation. But there are a lot of analytic systems out there. And every OVP has their own version of analytics. So I'm not going to talk about Brightcove's analytics. I'm not going to talk about how those backends all do their analytics, because those are more full-featured platforms where they're offering more than analytics, but of course it's an important part of that offering. So there's Snowplow, and of course Elastic. I know it more just as Elasticsearch. Amazon has actually built an offering around the open source offering around Elastic and this is something where it's a bit, I haven't had to get into it. Again, I got to find which tab I had it open, but just elastico.com. Oh, there it is. So they have a suite of open source software that you could run. Again, other people have taken these open source code, these code bases, and already made services that you can use. Like I said, Amazon has a version of Elasticsearch that you can use. And so that's another popular open source analytics tool. Again, anything that can basically receive data over an HTTP call and store it for you and then try and present it to you back could be considered an analytics system. So even if you wanted to build your own, there's not, I mean, at the end of the day, the core components of analytics aren't, like I said, you got to collect, store, and retrieve those analytics, and so there you go. These 4 services are what I played around with the most in prep for this session. I'll be completely honest, when the guys from Zencoder, Steve Heffernan and John Dahl, created Zencoder, they then, that was bought by Brightcove, their next big effort was Mux and Mux.com. And they started with Mux Data. Now Mux is also turned into a video platform, so don't, when I go into it, I'll be clear to make that distinction. But I want to go back to Google Analytics. That's by far one of the most popular analytics services, GA as it's abbreviated, and nearly every player that you can use, whether it's an open source player like VideoJS or JW Player, has some kind of tutorial or sample hooks for you to use Google Analytics. And again, I'm going to show some quick code examples here. Don't make fun of me for opening Dreamweaver, but I just pay for Creative Cloud, and I was a Flash dev in a previous life. It's a glorified text editor, FTP manager, really, for me. I'm not saying it can't do super powerful JavaScript or anything like that. So again, this is just sample code that I grabbed and I modified it a tinge for this sample. But in addition to having my player library for JW Player, there's a Google Tag Manager. That's a specific way to send data into Google Analytics that JW Player was using for this tutorial. And again, this was just stub code that I copied and pasted from their site. And then more importantly, this is the real gotcha right here. If you're familiar with JW Player payloads, all you have to do is declare a empty object for a GA attribute, and then that automatically tells JW Player to start sending events into Google Analytics. So really simple to get started with, and Google Analytics has some quick visualizations around that too. So I have my Google Analytics account open. I can see if any of you did load up the stream. I could be playing it now too. It's so exciting. None of you are watching it right now. My please stand by clip. But what's interesting, and this again, like it had been a while since I'd looked at Google Analytics. For my government clients, this is a non-starter. We can't use Google Analytics. The government doesn't, at least the Canadian government doesn't, or provincial government doesn't want IP data stored by Google in this kind of fashion. So we're not using Google Analytics for any government work, but it will. Oh, look, so a couple of you are watching it right now. So, or maybe someone, I tweeted it and put it on my Facebook feed too. So it's going to give me some information as people log into this, and it's based on a polling interval, and we can see that we've got some circles showing up where these users are. So they're probably in this room. So depending on what network they're using, it's going to be based on an IP lookup like that. And I can also see, of course, the pages. This is an interesting one here, and I'm going to talk about this later. So this is the active page. This isn't a page, but this is Wowza doing that lookup of where. So I have Wowza calling back out, and because this is I'm not using a CloudFront URL for this. In this example, we're going. I think we are actually. Let me double check the code on multi. I shouldn't speak out of turn. Oh, here it is right now. That's it right there. I was playing it earlier, so I'm going to add a third one. If I look at the page source, I'll know right away. So this live.bcgov.cdm videoRx, that's a CNAME for a CloudFront distribution, so I know right away this is going from CloudFront. So the interesting thing here, and this is really just sort of a footnote to this whole presentation, is that what the analytics is showing here is probably the edge that CloudFront is being called from, right? Because Wowza is reporting the connection coming into Wowza, and so even though there might be 2 people here watching it, it's showing one connection active from a CloudFront edge. So, and I could probably tag this differently. Actually, now that I just put 2 and 2 together and realize that this is showing me CloudFront edges, I can control in the Wowza module how I format that string, so I would know whether or not that's coming directly from a Wowza box or not. I'll talk about that a little bit too. So that's Google Analytics for you. Again, I'm going to demo some of this as I go through it. And I'm sort of starting from what this is exactly how my exploration was conducted for the R&D I did for this session. So, and again, this is all playing into the stuff that I need to start providing my clients when it comes to live event streams. And so, and again, most of the people I'm streaming for, they're not huge organizations like NFL or any kind of numbers on that. They're, I would say the top number of subscribers I have to deal with would be in the 10 to 20,000 range, which is still a lot of people watching something, but we're not talking millions of people. But again, and I'll show you a little bit of that growth on my end as well, how I got to the conclusions I have. So. I brought up Mux and I got distracted for a bit. I'm going to go back to Mux. So one of the reasons I like Mux is because if you want quick and dirty analytics where you don't have to spend a whole lot of time designing your whole experience around getting this data out, you can use something like Mux. So Mux has, I'm already logged in. Mux gives you a lot of information up front. More importantly, and I'm not going to, this isn't a whole tour of Mux, but you can define workspaces essentially. Right now I have a development workspace that I called streaming media for this demo. It does show me 2 concurrent users right now too. But it gives me a lot more video-centric information than Google's going to tell me unless I start formatting custom reports and know how to do that in Google, right? So it's going to give me, right now I don't have enough users to give me an accurate rebuffering percentage, but this is, like if I'm even with just a few hundred people, I can find out really quickly just by coming into this control panel 10 minutes into a broadcast and see what this rebuffering percentage is. And if it's high, that means that a lot of people are having problems watching that stream potentially if there's a rebuffering state happening. And rebuffering, of course, means you've buffered, but then you've gone back to having to rebuffer it again. And it's showing me that I gave it a label. And I'm going to just show you really quickly how easy it is to, like again, most of these services want to make it easy for you to put their code into a player. They've got several integration libraries, and one of them is a JW player integration. So again, I have a JW player library. This could be videoJS. It could be any number. Remember, they invented videoJS, Encoder guy, so of course they're going to have a videoJS tie into this. But they have a JW Player Mux library that I have to make sure is available on the page with the player. And more importantly, after I initiate JW Player, and again, this is all code that they give you samples of. They want to establish the page load start time. So there's a player init time whenever you initialize the player. Since I initialize it as soon as the page loads, I'm just using the current date. Timestamp, and these are all the properties that I can specify and pass into the events that Mux is capturing. So I can go through, if users were logging in, I could pass it, a user ID. And again, this could all, in a production scenario, I want to expose all this information like on the main page in a view source like this. It would be hidden in its own call, and we could pass all these attributes dynamically from the database into the page so that all this looks like just a bunch of variables and not hard-coded values like they are now. But again, for most of the events that I'm doing, they're one-off events. They don't run in a series or anything like that where there's even a centralized management system for the events themselves. But you could easily put a lot of dynamic information into this. The biggest important thing with most of these vendors is having a key that identifies you and your account, just like you have a Google Analytics ID. I skipped that, but I presume most of you are familiar with Google Analytics. I'm going to go back there real quick. That's the only thing I had to change in this script is my ID for that site. So for my videoRx Google Analytics sub-account, that's the tracking ID for it. So that's the only value I need it to know. Same thing over here with Mux. I need some kind of ID that recognizes this so I know which area to go into my Mux account. I know that this is for the stream media demos that I set up. Of course, it can actually gather a lot of metadata straight out of JW Player. I'm just hard coding it here. The fact that JW Player exposes its versions in JavaScript, the Mux code could grab it from that as well. And I'm not going to go through all of the various attributes, but they've been pretty comprehensive with how they've set it up. And again, that's sort of an all-in-one solution. I haven't really played around with exporting data from MUX. I'm going to just show you quickly that this is just the real-time dashboard. I think that costs a little more to get real-time, but there's other viewer metrics that you can get access to. They have this overall viewer experience score, 100 being great. So far it looks pretty good at 89%. Playback success is at 97. Startup time, these are all based on 0 to 100. The closer we are to 100, the better. So they try to visualize things easy for, again, stakeholders, right? I can get total video views. They have definitions of everything that's presented on this page. So if you're brand new, you can go in and just click these categories, see, oh, look at that. We've got, you can see these experience scores, like we were talking about quality of experience, is broken down by browser. So if I started to see, oh, it looks like Chrome had the worst experience, but everything else was pretty good. And you could sort of go back and say, well, what do we need to fix something for Chrome? Like what's throwing an error there? Maybe it's JW Player, who knows? But you can go down and, again, I don't want to spend too much time drilling down, but a lot of information. I should also mention that all these vendors want your business, so it's super easy usually to get trial accounts at least for 2 weeks. And if you're serious about it, they'll extend it for probably whatever time period you need for your stakeholders to make a decision about it. And again, if you're new to analytics, I would suggest getting trial accounts. So even if you want to roll your own, you have some benchmarks to compare what you're trying to build against what other vendors are doing. Another offering that I was having a lot of fun playing with yesterday was DataZoom. The CEO was walking around yesterday, but I think she had to leave to get to another engagement. Let me just make sure I've got the right tab. Here it is. I reconnected it. So I'm already in my dashboard view. Again, they didn't make me any special account because I'm with Stream Media or anything. I just followed their sign up with automated email activation of this account. And I'm going to just, again, what's interesting is like these terms and concepts are pretty consistent from one analytics system to the next. I think DataZoom does a great job at visualizing it for you, but they have this concept of collectors, which, like I already talked about, is the way that you're going to gather and collect your data. You have connectors so that we can take the data out of the collector and pass it somewhere useful. The connector, though, this is really just defining your data store, and the data pipe defines how you take your collector and match it to a connector, because you could have one DataZoom account manage several different entities. And I'm just going to go right now into what you would do first, which is set up your collectors. So they make it, again, they have a really great visual interface here. I could just click plus to add a collector here. And again, just to give you, what I find again is super useful with these services is you can start to see what you would have to be looking into when you're building your own service. So they've got all the major vendors for players, right? We've got Fire TV for over the top with Amazon's Fire TV. We got TheoPlayer, Brightco, Kaltura. This list is, you've seen all these vendor names here at Stream Media. If they've been in the space for a while, then they're going to be here. And so I've already defined two, JW config, and there's nothing to do in these configs. The only thing you do after telling it what player API, notice it's looking for JW Player 8. I don't know if it's version specific with some of the API calls, but I didn't see a JW Player 7, for example. But this flux data, that's specific to DataZoom and gives you some insight into how they're collecting data. They're using a polling interval, essentially. And so I can pull data, and the default here is super, I think the default was 1 second. The way that DataZoom makes its money is by the data transfer, right? So if you're collecting a lot, like if I collect data every second from a JW Player, and it's a 2-hour event, that's a lot of data going to DataZoom and forming it. And so it's a polling mechanism. I'm fairly certain, I haven't made it through all the API documents by any stretch on DataZoom, that you could customize event handlers so that it's not strictly a polling interval, but I think this is so they can cover their bases well from one collector to the next. You can specify this polling interval, and so rather than detecting a bit rate change, it's just polling nonstop, so it will see if there's a bit rate change, right? So if I go from 1 megabit to 500 kilobits in an HLS rendition, I would know based on the polling. And so I set it to be a little less aggressive than 1 second. I think I had that at 10 seconds. I'm just going to cancel it. And the same thing for other configurations. It's all about this flux data interval, as they call it. And again, that's one way of approaching collecting data, is just to sort of use a timed interval to see what's going on with the player. And notice you get a specific configuration key for this collector. So that plays in, and again, what's the beauty, I think, of DataZoom is how easy they've made it for you to use their service. And again, you get a lot of data free. Like if you just want to try this with some smaller live event streams that you're doing in your org, you could probably get some useful stuff going right away. Let me go ahead and pull up the DataZoom specific example. And again, I'm showing this all in the context of JW Player, but it would work with any other player that they've listed there. They even had a generic HTML5 player category. But all you do at the bottom, so I don't have to do anything to JW Player. I don't have to do anything extra in the document. All I have to do is put this beacon script at the very end of my document. And this beacon, because of that configuration code that's passed into this script configuration tool, it's going to serve back JavaScript specific to JW Player that knows how to tie into its event APIs, or at least track its playback states, right? Because every vendor is going to be different with how they control video states. If you saw Steven before lunch, he talked about those kind of playback states and capturing them more from a state perspective and not so much from a UI perspective, right? Don't put your analytics on a button press on a play button. Maybe you can initiate play from several places. Maybe you want to track that if you're super detailed with analytics, but at the end of the day, you probably just want to know, was the video playing or was it stopping? So anyway, there's the beacon script, and that's as simple as a collector is for DataZoom. And I'm going to cancel out of this and then show you a connector. So a connector is that data storage that we were talking about. I set it up with just a generic Amazon S3 bucket, and I tried out Splunk yesterday. I'll talk about Splunk in just a minute. It's a pretty popular tool. I've heard it talked about with a few colleagues. They do have again, I don't want to go off on a tangent on Splunk just yet, but let's take a look at Amazon S3. So S3, of course, is just cloud storage. Simple storage service is what S3 stands for. So if I bring up my little rubber ducky here for CyberDuck, I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh here. So this is that bucket that I configured there. I just need my secret access key, and I can see the data that it was storing from yesterday. It hasn't yet made a bucket for today. Or actually, did it? It made a bucket for today. Sorry, 508. So this is what I get out of that. So what DataZoom is doing is dumping JSON files for the collection intervals that I've set up. So I could potentially see a ton of JSON documents show up in here, and I think I already have one loaded in Text Wrangler. Yep, there it is. Let me blow that up a little bit, so you can get a sense. And again, like what I find interesting is you can, if you're trying to, where's my view? Let's, I can't even remember how I can increase fonts here, right here. Show fonts. Let me just select all and make this big. There we go. Okay. So this is the JSON data structure that DataZoom is using. So everything that they're tracking is in here. I think, again, they have an API offering, so I could probably go into my account and change this on an API level. They're not exposing these controls yet in their user interface, but a lot of information's gathered. And so the idea with DataZoom, and I don't know if there's competitors on it, and they get pretty detailed. Like it tracks where your ISP that they're connecting from. I can tell this was from the airport, from the hotel, because they're using Wayport as the ISP here at the Hilton. So this was a test I did yesterday. They're giving me the lat, the long. They're giving me a page reference. Every JW Player, notice they're giving me the version string right there. So I didn't even have to specify that. all of the relevant metrics are there. That's all I really want you to know when you're looking at that. Again, I encourage you to look at it yourself because it's so easy to use. The last step in setting this up, though, so that you can start gathering events is a data pipe. So again, what I really like about DataZoom is it serves as a great graphical representation of what you would have to design on your own if you were going to build it. And I love that they've got this little tool like this. So I can add as many collectors as I want to go to multiple connectors. And I can make different pipes. I'm not restricted to one. Like if I had one HLS JS player that I just wanted to go dump stuff on Amazon and I was building out my own kind of back end to break down this, I could just have that as its own pipeline. So you can have as many data pipes as you want. Again, in this case, I just want all players to distribute all their data to both of these services as collectors. So pretty neat. Again, they're really just serving as a bridge. And you might be like, well, what's the benefit of this? What the benefit is that you don't have to do, what I was showing you earlier in Dreamweaver with my multi-example. The example that I had you load up had all three vendors actively gathering analytics. And this is something that I have seen done before, not with stuff that I've set up, but that let's get Google Analytics. Oh, and yeah, we're using this other analytics provider. Those are all calls that have to come out of this page, right? So now I have three beacons of sort. I have got beacons going out to Google Analytics. I've got a beacon going out from Mux because I've got the Mux library. And I've got the beacon for DataZoom on this page. So that's three calls coming out for every player event or faster based on the interval here. And that's cumbersome. And so DataZoom's whole offering, I think, came out because they acknowledged that, hey, you know what? You can use, if you need multiple analytic services, it's best if you just collect that data once and send it to all those services because then you have a single point of entry on the player and then you can send it out. And that is very nice. And again, you could build a similar system on your own, but DataZoom's got it all ready to go for you. So that's pretty cool. Again, I've been really intrigued with their offering as I've gone through this, and I'm not paid to say any of that. I actually credit David Hassoun from Realize for letting me know about it. Him and June Hyder both were talking about it. Splunk is another provider that they listed here. So I actually, when it comes to the connectors, if I go in here, you can see all the various backends that they support. So I could send data to Brightcove. I could send it to Amazon Kinesis. Kinesis is becoming more and more popular for real-time data ingestion. Amazon Redshift. We've got New Relic, Datadog. Those are all, I can even send it to Google Analytics here if I want a copy of it going to Google Analytics. Of course, at the end of the day, I'll go back to my dashboard. The data usage is what they're going to bill me for or stop collecting after a certain point on my free trial. So if your data collection doesn't have to happen that often, like again, like for some of the government work I do, they don't have events on a daily basis. I'm now in the middle of an engagement for the NIH. Could the NIH use something like this? They have like 10 broadcasts a day at the NIH, so it would start to consume a lot of collected data right away. And of course, you've just got to be mindful. Can you even use off-prem or cloud services with your client? Again, it's going to vary based on your client's needs and their business requirements. I go till 2:45. I think I get a full hour. Jan, do I go to 2:45? So Splunk is what I wanted to show you next really quickly. And this is where I had some fun as well prepping for this workshop. Let me just find my Splunk page. Where did I leave it? Way back here. Oh, there it is. So Splunk, I'm not going to go through the tutorial. To DataZoom's credit, they had a really nice Splunk tutorial on how to set up a connector. And this is so you can go to Splunk and get a free cloud instance. That's what I'm running right now is a free cloud instance. I didn't have to give them, none of these services, by the way, required my credit card, which I thought was really cool. I didn't have to give them something that I had to cancel. They're just going to stop, it's just going to stop working. So Splunk is at its heart just a big database that you could query and then visualize that data. And it took me a while to figure out how to build a map, but I made my own dashboard here and had to figure out how to query that JSON data that data zoom is sending it. So the two things I just want to quickly show here, because again, tutorial, Jan and I write for a living, and so whenever I see these vendors, I'm like, man, where's the quick start for what I'm trying to do? Because what I'm trying to do and show you is it's pretty common, and I couldn't find it. So I'm just going to show you that if you sign up for a Splunk trial and you want to find out how am I going to get data from data zoom into this, just know you have to go to settings. This is going to be in the recording. Data inputs. And in data inputs, they sort of hide it in here. So the biggest in Splunk, and you can actually run Splunk in they have a free community version. So if you want to run Splunk on your own EC2 instance or your own server on your network, you can do that. You can even buy a license to it that lets you, they have different licenses. So, and I don't think they're necessarily cost prohibitive, but obviously the simpler your analytics setup is, the more likely the free versions are going to work. The more complex it gets, the more you're likely going to pay or need the more full offering. But right here, the very first one that we'll see under data inputs is HTTP event collector. Data zoom is just sending stuff out over HTTP. Again, you could build your own polling script or whatever you want to call it for your own player and send that data into Splunk. So you have to go into so settings, data inputs, and then it's hidden up here a little bit. Again, it's a big UI. You have to go into global settings. I'm going to go through this real quick. Global settings, you have to make sure that tokens are enabled. By default, they're disabled. So that's a safety feature. But you come in here, turn tokens on, and you set it to type Json, because that's the data struct that's coming out of data zoom. JSON's a very popular struct format. I'd recommend you use that for your own data that you're passing in and out of the player. So that was all you had to do, and for getting the global settings. And then we went in and added a new token. So I'll just show you that real quick. You can give it any name you want. I just called it Stream Media, and you don't have to, these other things. You basically are making an ID that is valid on this system. That's all the token is. So I'm going to just back up and go back out here. So I've already got a token. Here's the token value right here, and I needed that token value for data zoom in order to inject into it. If I was building my own service layer on my own machine that was going to call into Splunk, I would need to know that token value. They give you, there are actually some helpful tutorials on, if you search deep enough on HTTP event collectors, you'll find a tutorial on how to use curl. You could use Postman. I know June was showing Postman on how tokens work with a typical call into this Splunk system. But at the end of the day, so it took me a good hour to get that part of it set up when I was running through this. Now I'm going to go back and show the dashboards that I was setting up. So when you're in your apps or on your home page of Splunk, when you go into it, notice I just have a random ID. This is running somewhere on Amazon EC2. And so I wanted to figure out, how do I build my own map? I wanted to give myself this challenge. How do I build my own map of views in the last 24 hours? So I had to go in, and I'm just going to edit this dashboard so you can see it, and I'll show you the search. So what's interesting is that Splunk, and this is a little small. Maybe can I blow that up with some generic zoom? Oh, I can. Nice. So this is a query. Remember I told you you have to figure out how to query your analytics? Well, this is specific to Splunk. So it happens in a very procedural fashion. So at first I have to tell it what the source is going to be. That's that data input I defined earlier, right, when I was showing you the input. So those tokens that that token that I specified back in data zoom when I set up the collector is this source. And then they have this lookup keyword. They have an internal database of the geography of the United States. This is a keyword very specific to Splunk. I can look up against this reference of lat and long values, latitude and longitude values. And I already showed you back in, you probably didn't remember it because I didn't tell you to memorize it, but if I go back and look, you can see that there is a struct called geolocation. There's an object, and it's got latitude and longitude. So I have to be able to drill down to this object and this property in my lookup on Splunk, because that's the way it's coming out of data zoom. And There we go. So I'm basically, so there's a field in this, again, you wouldn't know this unless you looked it up in the docs, but there's an internal database for Splunk called Geo United States or US States. There's 2 fields in that database, longitude, well, probably more than 2, but the 2 fields I need are lat and long, so longitude and latitude, and I have to tell it how to look those values up relative to my data source. Geolocation.longitude is the Json struct data that is in this source here. And so now I've got the latitude, the same with the longitude. And now I want to perform a stats operation. Again, this is a keyword that is specific to Splunk. It's very SQL-like, if you've ever worked with SQL as a query language. And we're just counting up by feature ID. So what this basically does is it's going to aggregate all the lat and longs that are in a geographic area like New York and group them into this count that is then going to be distributed in this chlorograph map. I forgot how you pronounce that word, but how do you say? Geom lets me then tell it it's going to be visualized on this specific type of map. So again, most of that there's a nice tutorial. You can set your time ranges here. You can use a time picker. I don't have an auto refresh set up for it, and it's just by generically going to show the last 24 hours. So, and then I just added that panel. So again, that took me about another hour to figure out how to add this map into Splunk. But you can see it's pretty nice. Sorry, I have to get out of edit mode. I forgot I zoomed into this page. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel because I don't need to do anything else. And they've got this nice little, you can customize these graphics too so that they're different colors, like to your client's brand or whatever. But I can now see where people have been watching this video as it's been that same URL that I handed out. I can see that there's a count of 155 views in New York. I can see there's 6 in Illinois, 3 in Minnesota, 13 in Colorado, and 4 in Arizona, and 6 in California. Great. So, and you can of course zoom into that map so that you can see. But again, this is all part of Splunk. It's not like it's using Google Maps or anything. So Splunk has this kind of visualization layer, but it's very low level. If you don't know how to manipulate or go into that data and get the data out that you want, then you will have to start, looking into those things. And they've got so many different panels that you can add to this. They've got bar charts, they've got graphs, but again, unless you're a data master of visualization, you might not know the best way to visualize. It's easy enough to pick on something like, again, what did I say most of my stakeholders want to know? They want to know where and how many people were watching and are watching during the broadcast. So that's a quick and dirty way for me to see the last 24 hours with this particular demo. I want to make sure I want to leave time for questions. I went through MUX. Oh, just briefly to show too, that's not specific to JW Player. This is HLS.js, an open source player, and again, just straight out of their sample tutorials, I just took that same URL. And again, it's all just about a beacon script for data zoom, just plugging in a different configuration ID. Now it knows, oh, you're using HLS.js because that's what you specified for this collector. So I'm going to collect information based on that. But what's nice about that is that regardless of what player you're using, you have a standardized approach to it. And again, I'm not here to pitch data zoom. I'm here. What I like is that they fully expose their data model. You can see what's going on. You can see if they do have some state tracking, time since buffer began, time since last add. Like they've tried to cover all their bases in terms of what's going on. Look, it even tracked that I had the volume set to 0, right? So all sorts of properties available in there. All right, well, I'm pretty much at the end of what I was going to show. I have a couple of resources that you can read. I wasn't going to go into it on the Wowza end because it was super Wowza specific, but they do have a module. If you want to gather statistics from your server, because we know when new sessions start on Wowza, there's a HTTP create handler or session create handler that you can spawn, and that's what they basically have a tutorial on how to tie your Google Analytics to your Wowza installation. Again, your mileage will vary on that if you're not using WAUs as your edge. If you're using CloudFront, then forget about it. You're going to have to use something probably on the player level to check against that. Thank you. I'm going to take questions now in the last what time we have. Any questions? Oh, come on. Surely I didn't knock it out of the park that well. No questions? I got a microphone to pass around. Okay, yeah, I'll take it. Oh, yeah, here, you can ask it. So you're going to be forever preserved here for posterity. Oh, now he doesn't want to ask it.
So when you're talking about real-time metrics for live streams, how difficult is it to get pinpoint accuracy on these real-time metrics in regards to things like video start failures, just not beyond concurrency, just
right?
Yeah, beyond like just thinking about these errors.
Right.
Like,
well, I would say the better you know the event model of the player that you're doing, you're going to be able to track those as well as the browser tech or whatever. I mean, there are some limitations, right, with HLS on iOS, right, because they don't expose the JavaScript handler for a bitrate change, right? But you can poll it, right? That's why, like, I think DataZoom took the approach that they did, because you're not necessarily, the finer you pull it, right? If you're pulling every second, you might know when into the stream it switched, like if that's the kind of metric you want to get, like when did it downshift, when did it up, how long did it take to recover? Those things, again, as long as you're capturing that point, it'll be, ironically, I think it's easier on non-Apple platform devices to know things about adaptive switching as an example. But the buffering state in general should be something you could track pretty easily. Again, I don't have a visual metric to show that. And the closest, again, in terms of out of the box that I know of is going to be Mux, in the sense that when you go into their real-time data, this is very fast. I would say the latency on this is probably only 2 to 3 seconds on average. When I start seeing, like, when I've tested it just with smaller groups as we're going through the implementation. But there's quite a bit in what they're capturing there. So I think that again, it's not just about concurrence. We can see the playback failures, and again they define it as you go down in their spec what's going on there. The thing that I find troublesome with Mux is that it's for real. They're pricing real time towards enterprise, which means it's expensive. So, and I'm hoping that they, for my business model, I would love to have a per event model. Like, hey, I'll pay you however so much per event for up to so many, users collected. But at this point, I'm exploring it more for. I have a greater appreciation for what they've put together here. I can understand why there's a certain level of expense to it, considering how minimum something like Splunk is out of the box, right? And how much work you would have to put into an open source or even a paid service to get the visualizations that you want specific for video. Again, there's other video offerings out there. Like if you're using an OVP like Brightcove, they're gonna have that's your one-stop shop, so they're going to have access to a lot more data and probably visualizations. But if you're building your own backend, picking those components, and again, just using these as references for what you might want to build in your own analytics visualization is super helpful. Any other questions? Oh, one more right here. Still got time?
Are there any metric collection open source options available for metric collection, basically?
Oh, for the actual, like, at the player level?
At different points of your network and CDN and the player level.
Well, I mean, at the CDN, they're not going to let you install anything on your own, right? I guess I'm misunderstanding the question.
In our case, we have our own CDN. So I come from Bloomberg, so we have our own CDN, right? So we have control over the network, in a sense. We'd want to know if there are open source solutions that could be installed on different parts of the network and on the client side where the player is installed to get all the metrics, and then maybe feed it to Splunk and then visualize the metrics.
Right. Well, again, I don't know what you're running on the server tech end. So if you have your own CDN, I would say, again, I could use WAU as an example. If you've got low-level if you own your own CDN and you have the exposure of an HLS session is created and destroyed, you would know, you could get, again, with Wowza, that's just Java code, so you just got to know if you were using something like Wowza. If you were using Nginx, like, I don't know how open source you want to get, but if your media servers are open source, then clearly you have access to all those session create handlers that you would need to. I think the bigger challenge, and one that I think you're making me think of, is like I was showing here, how do you reconcile server-based metrics and line them up appropriately with user-based metrics, even if you're just using it to vet, like how well did the player collector work versus my server collector, right?
That's one of the problems. The other problem is, how do we collect these metrics? Because you talked about solutions where you have to pay money for people to collect the data from different plugins, probably.
Right.
Then consolidate them in some data model, and then use that data model to send that data to the backend.
Right. Well, I showed DataZoom. They definitely built out their libraries for beacons, right? But I would say, like I was showing on GitHub, that you can, like video.js, I'm about positive has a Google Analytics tracker module, right? And so you could see how that's all open source. I would like go in and use that event model to then use, like the good thing about Splunk, if you were gonna look into that, because it's not open source, but it's freeware that you could play around with, is that they have a documented HTTP collector API, right? So however you want to send, I mean, it's nice that it can just accept a generic JSON payload. You can make it whatever payload you want as long as it's in JSON. Splunk can break that down for you, and if you were consistent with it, then that's half the battle there, is just determining all the stuff you want to track. So again, I'm probably not doing service to your question well enough, but I would say that, again, if I was in your position, I would be 99% positive you could find an open source solution around it. You're going to pay long term for it because you're going to dev it and maintain it yourself, right? Which is probably not a problem for Bloomberg, right? And so you can keep it all in-house. You can customize it to exactly what you need for Bloomberg, and probably get, I mean, that's a pretty big JSON payload, right? I mean, I shouldn't say pretty big relative to video, this coming out of data, all this data being gathered by DataZoom is what it is, but you may not need all that information, right? So the more, you can keep that payload small and frequent, right? Because the more metrics you have, the better over time for a given session. And they do, I wasn't sure, I'm pretty sure this has to be a Zune, a DataZoom value. They have a session ID here, so because this is polling, I'm going to have a lot of session IDs for the same user, right? And so I don't want to miscount each poll as a new user, right? And if I don't know my query lookup well enough, I could easily distort my map view, right? I might have 18 views when it's really one, right? Because I'm not going by a unique session ID. Like, only give me lat long for a unique session, and that's where there's actually a flaw, I can tell you right away, in my Splunk, because I'm not searching for a unique session ID and that. So I just didn't figure out the query language fast enough to put it into that search string. But again, I'm probably going off topic, so I would be happy to help with any other kind of information after the session that I might be able to provide. But thank you. I think we're out of time for questions. If there's any questions that you'd like to send my way. Again, just from speaking of from a selfish point of view with the Video Engineering Summit, if you have ideas that you'd like to see explored, this is a fairly new track that we're exploring, and really want it to be pertinent to engineers and such as yourself and anyone involved with engineering efforts for any aspect of streaming. Would love to see more proposals come in, and as we plan out west, and again, workshop ideas. If there's something you think would make a great hands-on workshop that wasn't offered, we'd like to hear those ideas too. If you are interested in being a speaker and or trainer, please let us know. There's all sorts of opportunities here. With that, I'll thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.